Good.
Okay, so as you guys know, I'm talking today about El Salvador and primarily about the Civil War there and about the FMLN, the Civil War that took place basically in the 1980s. I'm not like some expert on El Salvador, but I did get a chance to go there for a couple weeks this summer, and it was pretty interesting to talk to some people that I met there that lived through the war, and just get kind of their views and things on it. So again, not like an expert, but hopefully it'll be interesting and a little bit informative. To start out, it's important to mention that the situation in El Salvador for about the last 100 years was one in which basically like 14 families owned about 95% of the country, 95% of the land. So it's basically just an oligarchy where, again, a small number of people own pretty much everything. And all the other people, or most all of the other people, were just really poor, working the land that's owned by this like small clique of families in almost like slave-like conditions. So the situation there in terms of poverty, as in many other places in Latin America, is pretty bad. And that situation kind of came to a head in 1932 when El Salvador suffered from two things. One was the eruption of a volcano, which caused a humanitarian crisis, and also the Great Depression. Like many Latin American countries, their economy was geared towards exporting things like cotton and coffee to the United States. So there wasn't a lot of like farming going on for the country to produce its own food. They were producing basically cash crops or things that could be exported to the U.S. and other places for, obviously for currency. And so with the Great Depression, there was suddenly this major drop in demand for coffee and cotton, etc., from El Salvador, and so that caused additional poverty, a lot of hunger and things like that, because people just couldn't get the money that they needed to eat, basically. So as a result, in 1932, there was a peasant uprising led by a communist named Farabundo Martí. And as a result of that uprising, the military government basically massacred lots and lots of people. Supposedly about 30,000 peasants were killed during that uprising, and that left kind of a scar on the psyche of people in El Salvador that, if there's ever any kind of popular struggle or uprising of any kind, that that's kind of what happens, is that a bunch of people will get murdered. And of course that's what happened again later. During the Civil War. But at any rate, that massacre in 1932 was called La Matanza. It was referred to as the massacre, which is what that translates to. So conditions from that time up until the 1970s were just bad in terms of poverty. There were a few times there was civilian rule, but for the most part there were military dictatorships. And so in 1970, the first guerrilla organization was formed by a guy named Cayetano Carpio, who split off from the Salvadoran Communist Party to form a new, guerrilla organization that was going to try and overthrow the military dictatorship through armed struggle. The Communist Party was founded, I believe, in 1932, and they were mostly involved in like electoral politics and trying to organize trade unions and things like that. But they didn't actually, they didn't advocate armed struggle or overthrowing the government or anything like that. So this was kind of a new development, but this guerrilla group, wasn't particularly large, and they were up in the mountains and didn't have a lot of influence. And throughout the 1970s, a lot of Salvadoran priests and teachers tried to form self-help groups amongst the peasants. A lot of that had to do with liberation theology. The Catholic priests that were, thought the emphasis of the church should be on assisting the poor. And as a result of that type of organizing, the elite classes got really scared about that, and so the military government, started sending out death squads to kill people, especially teachers and priests and union organizers. And in fact, while I was down in El Salvador, there was the bishop of one of the Mormon wards in San Salvador I got a chance to talk with him, and he told the story about how his father was murdered by the Salvadoran army because he was a teacher. Even though, as far as this bishop who was telling me the story knows, as far as he knows, his dad didn't have any links to any leftist groups or guerrilla groups or anything like that. But teachers were just kind of, and priests were considered just, you know, sympathetic to the communists, and so oftentimes they were just murdered. And at any rate, that's one example of just these kind of random murders that were being committed by these military-backed death squads that were roaming around the country. So the situation was starting to get pretty bad, and in 1977, a fellow named Oscar Romero was appointed Archbishop of El Salvador, and he was actually a pretty conservative guy. He had gotten his doctorate in theology in Italy when Mussolini was actually in power. When he was on his way home from studying in Italy, he stopped in Cuba with a friend, and because he had been in fascist Italy, he was put in like an internment camp by the Cubans for a couple months. And so when he was appointed Archbishop, the people in the government were really happy about it, and all of the like leftist liberation theology priests were really disappointed. They thought, oh, you know, we're going to lose all the support that we had up until this point in time. And kind of the common thing for the elite classes to do in El Salvador at the time was anytime there was a new archbishop, you throw a big party for him, you give him a bunch of money, you invite him to come, you know, stay in your villa and shower him with all these gifts and things like that. And the same thing happened with Oscar Romero. Not too much later, though, a good friend of Archbishop Romero's named Rutulio Grande was a Jesuit priest who was organizing these like self-help or self-reliance groups amongst the peasants. And he was murdered by the army. And so that really woke up Oscar Romero to have a good friend of his murdered like that. And so he started routinely condemning the human rights abuses of the government and of the military. So every week in his radio program, he would just go through the human rights abuses that the military had committed. He would do the same thing in when he would give sermons during Mass. And he was pretty courageous in speaking out, and he basically cut off or stopped associating with, you know, people from these rich families that he had previously been friends with, and made a lot of comments about the fact that he pretty much knew he would get killed for what he was doing. And finally that did happen on March 24th, 1980. While he was giving Mass, he was assassinated. Like a lone gunman came and just shot him from outside the doors of the chapel, because they were open at the time. It's just summer, or well, spring, but the weather's always hot down there, so they didn't even close the doors of the churches. And I got a chance to go visit and see that church while I was down there. So another thing that Oscar Romero did was that he asked Jimmy Carter, who was the president at the time, to stop sending military aid to the government, because it would sharpen the repression of these peasants who were just struggling for their basic human rights. And of course, that request was ignored. So again, that was in 1980 that Archbishop Romero was assassinated. And so again, as conditions got worse and worse, the FMLN was formed, which was basically like a group of 5 different leftist organizations, including the Salvadoran Communist Party. So again, that organization was called FMLN, or the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, of course named after the man who led the peasant uprising back in '32. And so they went on the offensive. Their first major military offensive was on January 10th, 1981. And much like the FARC today, they took over a couple different departments of the country, especially up in the mountains, and basically controlled them throughout the duration of the Civil War. Shortly thereafter, the military government was overthrown in a coup, and there was like a civilian junta that was put in place that was more reformist and tried to institute land reform and things like that. but they were never able to control the military. The military just continued to go around murdering people and do whatever they wanted. And so there was just a lot of violence throughout the course of the Civil War, which lasted from 1980 until 1992. About 80,000 Salvadorans were killed. After the peace accords were signed, the United Nations sponsored like a truth and reconciliation type process, and they issued a report stating that, or that found that the government had committed about 85% of the human rights abuses, and then the guerrillas or the FMLN had committed apparently the other 15%. Just to give you an idea of how the violence went in that regard. But again, the Salvador military, they were just doing some of the most brutal things. At the very end, I'll just go ahead and read portions from this quick article by Noam Chomsky called The Crucifixion of El Salvador, where he kind of goes through some of the nastier things. But it was just really brutal, a lot of massacres. Anyone suspected of being a communist, they would just kill you. In talking to another guy who was actually the first counselor in the Mormon congregation in San Salvador that I just visited while I was down there, he talked about how when he was 12 years old, he was walking down the street one day and an army unit came by and basically kidnapped him. And so he was like being taken to a military base and to be like forcibly conscripted into the army. And luckily, a lady from his Mormon congregation came by and basically said, "Hey, that's my son." Of course, it wasn't. She was just lying, but she knew that the military was taking him, and so they were like, "Is this really your mom?" And he's like, "Yeah." And she kind of just begged and cried and all that and convinced the soldiers to let him go. And they said, "Okay, fine, but if we ever see you around here again, we're taking you." And that was really common. There was that happened to that guy, plus the guy I was staying with. There was a Catholic family we were staying with while we were there. And same thing happened to him. He managed to get out of it because his mom worked for the police. And so she had some connections and managed to get him free. But the army would just go around and basically kidnap young kids like that. They'd get them hooked on drugs. They'd tell them all kinds of crazy stories about, the communist guerrillas and why they needed to kill them. So the people fighting for the army didn't really know what was going on. They just were told, "Hey, you got to go fight these guys." They were shown like Rambo movies and things like that, just to get them like excited to go killing. So they didn't really even know what the war was about, but they were just young and indoctrinated and kind of brainwashed. Some other atrocities that the Salvadoran military committed were there were 4 American nuns that were killed. There were also, I believe it was 8 Jesuit priests that were killed in 1989. They were kind of like influential intellectuals in El Salvador that taught at the University of Central America in San Salvador. And the army just walked in and shot them to death. And a lot of these murders were committed by, again, units of the Salvadoran army that had been directly trained by the U.S. You guys have all heard stories like that, people from the School of the Americas and things like that. So these really elite battalions that had the U.S. training were the ones that did a lot of the worst atrocities. So the war continued. The Reagan administration increased aid to the Salvadoran government, obviously over what President Reagan or Carter had, and basically prevented and made sure that the government never tried to, have peace negotiations or end the war or anything like that. The Reagan administration made sure that the war kept going. But finally, when Reagan was no longer president, and as a result of a big military offensive that the FMLN did, where they actually took over parts of the city of San Salvador, the capital itself, that was kind of a show of strength by the FMLN, and so the government not getting the same support from the U.S. that they had when Reagan was president, and seeing that the FMLN was like gaining in strength still, they finally decided, hey, we should start some peace negotiations. And so finally in 1992 is when the war ended. And in that major offensive, there was a guy that I talked to who lived through that. He was just a young kid but lived in San Salvador at the time, and he talked about how some of the guerrillas occupied the house of his cousin, or his uncle, actually it's his uncle I think, who was like a baker. He just like baked bread, and the guerrillas occupied his house, and they would use like bazookas, basically like blow holes in the wall so they could like move from house to house just so they could avoid like aerial bombardment from the Salvadoran military. So the neighborhoods that the FMLN did take over, the army did bomb using like airplanes and things like that from the sky. So they were just bombing like civilian neighborhoods to try and kind of root out the guerrillas. And apparently the guerrillas had their base in a big hill. There's some hill in a part of San Salvador in the capital, and they just dug a ton of tunnels, and that was kind of their base. And so that hill also was bombed a lot by the Salvadoran military, but they had dug such deep and good tunnels that they were able to kind of keep the offensive going with using that particular hill as a base. So at any rate, when the war ended, FMLN then became a political party, just started contesting elections, and they were immediately one of the biggest blocs in the legislature in El Salvador. A lot of the mayors of different cities in El Salvador are from the FMLN, but more of their support was from the countryside rather than the city. The city in San Salvador was more supportive of the government, and so it was in the countryside that most of the human rights abuses and the massacres and things like that were committed. So people in the city, to a large degree, didn't really even know the extent of what was going on, because life kind of continued as normal and most of the fighting was in the countryside. But they've continued to, the FMLN has kind of continued to become more popular, and so finally just in 2009, they managed to win the presidency. A guy named Mauricio Funes is currently the president of El Salvador, and he was one of the first FMLN leaders that was not actually a guerrilla. He was a journalist during the war, and his brother was killed by the army during the war, but he wasn't one of the guerrillas or the leaders of the FMLN during that time. So now the FMLN, there's still people that are kind of more hardline or Marxist-Leninist, but it's kind of more like a social democratic party, like that you would find in Europe or something. Socialist, but not really trying to make the type of changes that obviously Castro did in Cuba. And when this guy Mauricio Funes was elected in 2009, he really made a lot of conciliatory statements about wanting to keep really close ties to the United States. So far, they haven't really made a lot of the changes that you might expect from, like a socialist party. So we'll see how that goes. But that is the question. A lot of people in El Salvador now are really fed up with the government in general, which is one reason why they put the FMLN in power for the first time, as far as the presidency goes, even though they've been, again, the largest opposition group in the parliament for a long time. So we'll see how they end up doing and whether people are kind of happy with what they've done. The biggest problems now in El Salvador, obviously there's a lot of poverty still, but there's tons and tons of crime, especially due to gangs. Because of the war, there were a lot of orphans or people whose parents had to flee the country, and so they would be left with their relatives who didn't really keep too close an eye on them. So a lot of these young kids and boys basically formed kind of self-defense militias and things like that, just to kind of band together and protect themselves. And then a lot of the Salvadorans that went to the U.S. as a result of the war, apparently to protect themselves from the other gangs in Los Angeles, for example, like Mexican gangs and things like that. The Salvadorans formed their own gangs and kind of learned how to organize in that way, and then a lot of them ended up later on coming back to El Salvador, in the late 90s, and kind of took that existing infrastructure that the Salvadoran kids had formed, or the gangs that they had formed in El Salvador, kind of took that infrastructure and really ran with it in criminal directions. And so now that's kind of the thing that most people are worried about. There's something like 20 murders a day in a population of 5 million in the country, which is quite a bit. And so when you're down there, people are always saying things like, don't take the buses, or don't really walk around at night. You just kind of have to watch out because there's a lot of crime. We didn't have any problems when we were down there. We did ride the buses, but we tried not to do it at night because there's a lot of robberies and things like that. So our trip, was just fine. There are actually a lot of church groups that we noticed that were down there, so it's not like you can't go there. I don't want to over-exaggerate how like bad it is. Although there was an incident a week before we got there where one of the gangs that would basically ask for protection money from the different bus companies. They're all like private bus companies. And I don't know if one particular bus company didn't pay the protection money or what, but one of the gangs, or a group of people from one of the gangs, stopped a bus, locked the doors, and burned the bus to the ground, and burned like 17 people alive. So that just happened like right before we got there. And then apparently the guy in the gang who did it, who kind of gave the order, who was actually there and made that decision, was so scared because he didn't have permission to do that from the higher ups, and he basically realized that they would probably kill him for what he did, for bringing like bad attention, to that particular gang. And so he actually turned himself into the police like immediately. Because in El Salvador, like the maximum sentence you can get for anything, including murder, is like 20 years. So he figured that would be better than getting killed, I guess, by the gang. Just like an 18 or 19-year-old kid. So anyway, still a lot of problems, and that's kind of just like a basic overview. Maybe for the sake of time, let me just read. Let me just read this quick part that just kind of talks about some of the more brutal things that the Salvadoran military, again with the U.S. backing, was doing at the time. Again, this is from an article by Noam Chomsky. It says, the nature of Salvadoran army training was described by a deserter who received political asylum in Texas in 1990, despite the State Department's request that he be sent back to El Salvador. And his name was withheld by the court to protect him from Salvadoran death squads. It says, according to this deserter, draftees were made to kill dogs and vultures by biting their throats and twisting off their heads, and had to watch as soldiers tortured and killed suspected dissidents, tearing out their fingernails, cutting off their heads, chopping their bodies to pieces, and playing with the dismembered arms for fun. In another case, an admitted member of a Salvadoran death squad associated with the Atlacatel Battalion, I'm sure I'm not saying that right, which is the one that killed those Jesuit priests. So his name was Cesar Vilman Hoya Martinez, and he detailed the involvement of U.S. advisors and the Salvadoran government in death squad activity. The Bush administration has made every effort to silence him and ship him back to probable death in El Salvador. That would be the Bush 1 administration. Despite the pleas of human rights organizations and requests from Congress that his testimony be heard. The results of Salvadoran military training are graphically described in the Jesuit journal America by Daniel Santiago, a Catholic priest working in El Salvador. He tells of a peasant woman who returned home one day to find her 3 children, her mother, and her sister sitting around a table, each with its own decapitated head, placed carefully on the table in front of the body, the hands arranged on top, as if each body was stroking its own head. The assassins from the Salvador National Guard had found it hard to keep the head of an 18-month-old baby in place, so they nailed the hands onto it. A large plastic bowl filled with blood was tastefully displayed in the center of the table. According to Reverend Santiago, macabre scenes of this kind aren't uncommon. People are not just killed by death squads in El Salvador, they are decapitated and then their heads are placed on pikes and used to dot the landscape. Men are not just disemboweled by the Salvadoran Treasury Police, their severed genitalia are stuffed into their mouths. Salvadoran women are not just raped by the National Guard, their wombs are cut from their bodies and used to cover their faces. It is not enough to kill children, they are dragged over barbed wire until the flesh falls from their bones, while parents are forced to watch. Reverend Santiago goes on to point out that violence of this sort greatly increased when the church began forming peasant associations and self-help groups in an attempt to organize the poor. And again, that was all justified by Ronald Reagan in an effort to stamp out communism, even though many of the people who were killed, probably the vast majority, weren't even communists. And also because things were getting out of hand in Nicaragua in the 80s with the Sandinista Revolution, and they didn't want El Salvador to turn into another Nicaragua, so that was kind of the justification provided. So we'll just end there. Any like real quick questions before we all want to get out of here? Pretty bloody.
Looks like you're off the hook.
Did you go to prayer team?
No, I didn't get a chance to go out there. That was like the big guerrilla base out in the mountains in, I think, probably the eastern part of the country. I wish I could have. Apparently there's a guerrilla, an ex-guerrilla that gives like tours, and so you can really learn like a lot and see all kinds of stuff out there, but I didn't get a chance to go.
I lived in El Salvador this summer, and so I went.
Oh, you were there this summer? Oh, we were there at the same time.
Yeah.
Who were you there with?
With a humanitarian group.
It was like Health International?
Exactly.
Oh. Did you know, we'll talk after you. So.
Yeah.